Hello everybody. So when I'm thrifting, I love looking for fabrics and garments that are old and vintage. I love the look of fabrics that are a little bit yellowed and kind of have a tea-stained look. I like the colors that are more muted and just aged looking. But it's not always easy to find old vintage fabrics. So what I do is I buy the fabrics that I like, the colors that I like, the prints that I like, and I bring them home and I make them look aged and vintaged by dyeing them. So that's what I want to do today. I want to show you how you can make fabrics and clothing look like it's old and vintaged and have that tea-stained look. So if you would like to learn how, then sit back and watch and learn. So the first thing that you want to do is wet your fabrics, the fabrics that you're dyeing, and you want to soak them in warm water so that it opens up the fibers of the fabric so that the fabric will absorb the dye evenly. And you do want to make sure that your fabrics are clean, that there are no stains, because if there are any stains or oils or waxes on the fabric, then it's not going to absorb the dye in that area. So first I'm just rinsing my fabrics in warm water to prepare them for dyeing. Okay, so I've rinsed all of my fabrics in warm water and squeezed out the excess water. What you can do if you don't want to hand squeeze all of the water out, because that can be a tedious, tiresome task, you can put them in the dryer, or excuse me, the washer on the spin cycle and just spin the water out that way. The more water that is left in the fabrics, then the more diluted the dye is going to become. So you don't want to, you do want to make sure that you get all of the excess water out, because you don't want to dilute your dye. So these fabrics have been rinsed and the water squeezed out, so they're ready to go into the dye. The next thing you're going to do is fill your pot up with water. The pot that I'm using is about a 10-quart size pot, and I've filled it about 3/4 of the way up. And as you can see, my water is already hot, it's steaming. So you want to make sure that you use a pot big enough so that your fabrics will have room to swish around. I have a lot of fabrics, as you can see, so I'm not going to put all of those in at the same time. I'm going to do one or two at a time. But the key is making sure that you have enough room for your fabric to flow around and swish around in the water. So I have allowed enough room in my pot for the, I didn't fill it all the way up, as you can see, because when I put the fabric in, obviously it's going to fill up more. So now I'm going to prepare my dye, and the dye that I will be using is RIT all-purpose dye. This is good for natural fabrics, and I will be using, the fabrics that I'm dyeing are cotton, so I'm using RIT dye for natural fabrics, and I am going for a tea-stained look, so I'm going to combine dark brown and lemon yellow. Now you can get a pre-mixed dye that is, there's a tan color and an ecru color and a camel color that also work for this, but I like custom blending my dye, because I like the color that I get better with the lemon yellow and the dark brown. It's more of a tea-stained look, so I'll give you the ratios of that. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to mix up these two colors. Okay, I'm going to use about a 3-to-1 ratio of lemon yellow to dark brown. So I'm going to pour about 3/4 of a cup of the lemon yellow and 1/4 of a cup of the brown. And you do want to make sure that you shake these up really well before you pour them. Okay. So now I'm just stirring the two colors together to get them well blended. And now I'm going to pour it into the water. And go around in a circular motion just to make sure that it's dispersed evenly. And then I like to dip my cup in the water to get any excess that's still in the measuring cup. You want to use every little bit that you can. And now I'm going to take a big spoon and stir this up really well. And then I'll go ahead and put the lid on and let this get a little more hot. I'm almost going to bring it to a boil, but not quite. It just needs to be really, really hot so that when you put your fabrics in, the fibers open up and grab all of the dye. So I'm just going to let it come to almost a boil. Okay, my water is ready. It's nice and hot and steamy. So what I am doing is I'm using my sink. So I've moved my pot over to my sink, and the other side of the sink is filled with cold water. So after I dip my fabrics into the dye, I'm going to transfer them over to the cold water, and what that will do is close the fibers of the fabric up and just kind of seal that dye into the fabric. You want to make sure, of course, that you're using some good heat-resistant gloves. I found these gloves at Home Depot, and you can also find them online at Amazon. But if you don't use these, if you use regular, like Rubbermaid, the rubber gloves, it is going to burn your hands. So you want to use a good heat-resistant glove. I also use tongs when I'm dipping my fabrics in the water, but sometimes I have to reach in and pull the fabrics out, and I have to wring the fabrics out, so that's why I use the gloves. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so before I put the fabrics that I actually want to dye into the dye water, I'm going to use a piece of fabric that is just like a scrap piece of fabric. I'm going to put that into the dye first, and the reason that I do that is because sometimes there are little particles of dye that did not dissolve, and this is a good way to basically clean your water. So I'm going around with the tongs and with the fabric, and I'm wiping the bottom and the sides of the pot, and then just swishing this around in the water really good. And so it's going to absorb any particles of dye or junk, as I like to call it, that has not absorbed. Because if you don't do that, then you can get spots on your fabric. So this is just, we're just cleaning up the dye water really well with this scrap fabric. And notice how dark that is. So this is pretty dark, but this is a white piece of fabric, so it has really absorbed that dye. It is going to get a little lighter when I stick it into the rinse water, but this is why I like to start with my darker fabrics first. Like I'll start with this dark red and blue first, because obviously they're going to require more dye for it to show up. And then I save my lighter color fabrics toward the end, because every time I put a piece of fabric into this water, it's soaking up more and more dye. So toward the end, there's going to be less dye left in the water. So any fabrics that you don't want to be as dark, then you want to save those to the end. So that's another reason that I'm doing this, because I want to demonstrate to you how at the end I'm going to dye another piece of white fabric, and I will compare the two and show you the difference. Okay, so I'm just going to start with one garment at a time. These are flannel shirts that I'm dyeing, and I'm going to stick it in there and swish it around. And the longer you leave it in, the darker it's going to be. So I'm pulling this out right away because I don't want it to be too dark. And then I'm just going to squeeze this out with my hands, which is why I use the gloves, and then put it over into the rinse water. Okay, I have done about 3 or 4 shirts here, and as you can see, my rinse water is getting pretty dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer these shirts over to a big bin, this big galvanized metal bin, so that I can put clean rinse water in here and more shirts. So I'm going to just squish these out, put them in this bin, and then after I get them all rinsed, dyed and rinsed and placed in this bin, I'm going to put them in the washer on the rinse cycle and give them a second rinse. Okay, I have reached the end of my dyeing, so now I want to show you what happens when I dye a piece of white fabric. This is the white fabric that I dyed in the beginning, and so now let's see what happens now that I have used this dye water to dye a lot of fabric. Let's see what happens. You can already tell that, remember when I put that first piece of fabric in, how it absorbed so much dye and it turned really dark right away. And as you can see, this one is not very dark at all, but it does have a very nice aged look, stained look to it. I love that color. So that just demonstrates what happens each time you put fabric into the dye water. It's going to use up more and more of the dye that is in the water. So that is why it's important to save your lighter color fabrics for the end of the dyeing process. Okay, so I have all of my fabrics rinsed and placed in my big galvanized bin, and I'm going to transfer them over to the washer and put them on the rinse and spin cycle for a second rinse, just to make sure that I have all of the excess dye out of them, because I don't want that to bleed over onto any other materials that I might wash these with. Okay, so while my fabric is rinsing, I just want to go over a few things. First of all, you are going to want to make sure that you have some bleach handy, because this will stain your countertops and anything else that it touches. So I just like to keep some spray bleach handy to keep my surfaces clean anytime I get a stain on my countertop. And you probably want to wear an apron and, again, the gloves. So if you are going to be dyeing a really large piece of fabric that's not going to fit into a pot like this, what you can do is you can fill up a couple of pots of water, and then the big galvanized bin that I showed you, you could use something like that, or you can use a big Rubbermaid container, and you can boil 2 pots of water or 3 pots, however many you need. And you can put your dye in one of those pots, and then you can pour all 3 pots of water into the large container and just mix it up. So basically you're doing your mixing and your dyeing in the large Rubbermaid container or large galvanized bucket, whatever it is that you're using, and you're just going to boil however many pots of water you need. And then just mix them all together in the bigger pot. So that's a good way to, if you're doing a really large piece of fabric, or if you want to dye a bunch of fabrics all at the same time. I've done that before. If I have like several shirts that I want to dye and I don't want to dip them in one at a time, then I'll just mix like 2 or 3 buckets of water into a bigger container and then put my dye in there. And also what I wanted to tell you is what is going to determine the darkness of your color is, of course, how much dye you add to the water, how long you leave the fabrics in the water, and the temperature of the water. So if your water is not hot, it's not going to, the fabric is not going to grab the dye. It's just not going to soak into the fabric. So you want to make sure that your water is hot, and then you want to make sure that you leave your fabrics in long enough according to however dark you want the fabric. It's a good idea to test out your dye water first, and what I like to do is I will just simply use a paper towel. I'll just take off a paper towel sheet and dip the corner, or just dip part of it down into the water, and that gives me an idea of how my fabrics are going to do. Of course, this dye water has already been used, so this is not very dark, but so if I dip my paper towel in and it's really, really dark and I don't want it to be that dark, then I will just simply add more water to my dye, heat it up again, and that will dilute the color. And then, of course, if it's not dark enough, then you can add more dye, mix it up really good to make it darker. So this is all a learning process. You're going to want to use scrap fabrics at first to experiment with until you figure out exactly, the exact ratio of dye to water that you need. And there are lots of colors to choose from, but you're not limited to the colors on the shelf. You can mix those colors to make your own custom color, and I believe if you go to the RIT Dye website, they actually have a recipe menu to show you what colors you can mix to get a certain color. So that's really cool. So now we're just waiting for my fabrics to rinse, and as soon as those are done and dry, then I will show you the finished product. Okay, so I have washed and dried my fabrics and pulled them out of the dryer, and here they are, and I love how they turned out. If you go back to the beginning of the video and look at the pile of fabrics before they were dyed and compare them to this, then you will be able to see the difference. The colors are they're more muted, not as bright, and I just love the muted vintage look. They have an aged look about them, and I love that. So as you can see, let me see if I can find, this is the one that was a really bright red, and I don't know if you can tell in this light. It's looking like a little different color through my on the screen here, but it's more of almost like a burnt orange color instead of the bright red. And this was a bright turquoise and white, but now it is like a tea-stained color. The white is not white anymore, it's tea-stained. And then here was the one that was the really bright turquoise green color. So if you're looking for the aged tea-stained look, then this is how you can get it. And I did want to point out, if you remember, when I put that first piece of white fabric in the dye, it was very dark when it came out. Here it is. Now this is a lot darker than I wanted it to be. This is not tea stained. Let me get over here in the light. This is more of a, I guess you would say an ochre color, but it's a little darker than I wanted it. It's not really what you would call tea stained. So you want to make sure that you test out your dye water before you stick all of your fabrics in, just to make sure that it's going to be the shade that you want. I probably, if I were going to be dyeing just a few white fabrics, I would have adjusted that water before I stuck my fabrics in there. I would have added more water to dilute it so that it wouldn't be this dark. So you just want to make sure that you test out the water before you throw everything in there. I think I've covered everything. If you have any questions about this, then just send me a message in the comment section below, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. I just think that this is a really great way to make your fabrics look older and vintage and aged. So have fun with this, play around with it, let me know how it turns out for you. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so that you can be informed of my other helpful sewing tips and techniques such as this. Thanks a lot. See you later.